So we will start our first seminar, the second day. I'm trying to speak a little in English. It's not my scientific language, but I will try to tell something in honor of our guest, Dr. Jack Zipes. I'm very happy to meet you beyond the mail. We know a little about his text and his vast work. I count 20 books. Is that right? 20 books you wrote?
Wrong, 100.
Wow, we need to translate part of his work in Brazil. I'm trying to finish my only book in fairy tales, in Análise, linguistic in fairy tales. So I'm very young.
Yes, yes.
We have to learn.
I'm very old.
Okay. In the name of the team, on behalf of the team, I would like to thank you, FAPEMIG, our funding agency, for financing the translation and other costs of our international seminar. We know that the fantastic fantasy magical universe, which holds the dynamic of societies, is always encouraging language scientists and the most diverse areas. In this context, that the object of our tale already has its own epistemology and scientific autonomy that we hope to bring fantastic research from all over the world into contact today, to reflect together on the true semantic matrices which are fairy tale, I think. So, Professor Jack Zipes, our honored guest today, students, teachers from Brazil and out of the world. I don't know if there's other conferences here today, but I would like to tell welcome to our second day of the first international seminar on Fantastic Universo and the Analysis of Fairy Tale. Thank you. It's a pleasure to hear you, Dr. Jack Zipes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So would you like me to start now?
Yes, you can start.
Okay, thank you. So the title of my talk is To Be or Not to Be Eaten, the Survival of Traditional Storytelling. One of the great storytellers of the 20th century, the German playwright, very famous playwright, Bertolt Brecht, once wrote a story about a father who wanted to teach his little son a lesson by placing him on top of a 6-foot wall and commanding him to jump. "Jump, jump into my arms," cried the father. "I'll catch you." "No, no," the son responded. "I'm afraid. I won't, you won't catch me," shrieked the shivering child. "Of course I'll catch you. What do you think I am, a monster?" You promise, the son sobbed. "I promise." So the boy leapt from the wall. The father took a step back, and the child crashed to the ground in pain. The father, Bertolt Brecht, told this tale as part of the Herr Koine series of stories that he wrote in a dog-eat world. And he wanted to show that you can't even trust your father in a dog-eat world. So if we recall, Cronus, the great Greek god, devoured his children and had to be forced to regurgitate them. Abraham was no better. Though he did not eat his sons, he banished Ishmael to the desert, and he was prepared to kill Isaac and to prove his loyalty to God. Some stories even relate that Abraham did indeed kill both Ishmael and Isaac, and other narratives about the origins of the world involve bitter conflicts between a stern authoritarian father who refuses to have his power and laws questioned, and his children who are compelled to obey him or force death or banishment. More to the point, folklore is filled with tales of fathers, giants, ogres, monsters, sorcerers, cannibals, boogeymen, fiends, and devils who eat or beat young children. And men are not the only danger for children. There is also a fair share of mothers, grannies, witches, ogresses, sorceresses, and female demons who lust after children, punish them, and destroy them. Even those allegedly good fairies who have absolute control over children can be wicked, but they generally don't eat their own. Humans are the ones projected as monsters who eat and destroy their own. So we must ask, why? Why? In her thought-provoking and comprehensive study, No Go, the Boogeyman, the great Marina Warner comments, and I'm quoting from her book, the question, who eats and who gets eaten, reverberates in the material of boogiedom, how cannibalistic impulses beat in the cultural imaginary, and what significance they carry can still be heard in the tread of the flesh-eating ogre and his progeny. Whether he rattles his bones in strides in 7-league boots or comes whiffling through the tugly wood, control of food lies at the heart of the first werewolf story, the transformation of Lycaon of famous fairy tales like Hansel and Gretel, and less familiar ones that feature ogres and ogresses like Baba Yaga, vampires, and the undead progeny of Bram Stoker's Dracula, who walk abroad in the shadows of the culture. They all form part of the large family of fatal monsters who cannibalize humans. Food, procuring it, preparing it, cooking it, eating it, dominates the material as the overriding image of survival. Consuming it offers contradictory metaphors of life and civilization, as well as barbarity and extinction. Though food may be the dominant element in folklore, Warner makes clear that there is no one exclusive reason for the unsavory and uncontrollable appetite of adults, often projected metaphorically as monsters who abuse their power over children. The causes are numerous: famine, starvation, disobedience of the young, fear of losing power, jealousy, and so on. Often, it is difficult to discover any reason whatsoever. The adult as ogre or witch arbitrarily eats children, lives off children, is obsessed by children, and devouring the young is his or her way of life. The appetite rules. Fee, fi, fo, fum. I smell the blood of an Englishman. Be he alive or be he dead, I'll have his bones to grind my bread. But it's not only young Jack who is often in danger of being devoured. Tom Thumb and his brothers in Charles Perrault's tale, based on French folklore, are threatened by an ogre who unintentionally slits the throats of his own daughters because he thinks they are the boys whom he wants to eat. The witch in Hansel and Gretel intends to bake and eat Hansel, and we never know why, unless she is indeed a projection of the stepmother or mother. Even then, her reason is murky. In many of the Sicilian folktales I've translated, there is a Mama Drago, or sometimes just a Drago, who is essentially characterized by her desire for human flesh in one of Giuseppe Pitret's variants of Rapunzel called The Old Woman in the Garden. The witch is not as benign as she is often depicted. She wants the daughter of the woman who trespassed in her garden so that she can eat the young girl. Recently, I've come across a small Somali tale called Degdeu, which means long ear. It concerns a woman who, after the birth of her third child, suddenly turns into a cannibal and eats her husband. She continues to thrive on human flesh, especially the young, but she doesn't eat her own daughters. In fact, they kill her, and the girls celebrate and marry, except that the third daughter is reluctant to marry. She's reluctant to marry because she fears that she too may be cursed by the same fate and turned cannibal after the birth of the third daughter. Her future husband convinces her that her fear is ridiculous. They marry and have 3 children. And one day, when he returns from work and wants to enter the house, he has an unpleasant surprise. I won't tell you the chilling end of this tale. You can probably guess. You probably won't even be surprised. After all, we live in a world filled with Draculas, vampires, vicious demons from outer space, sinister robots run amok, demented scientists, sadistic serial killers, and barbaric politicians indifferent to the murder of innocent children that they cause. Nothing, however, should surprise us. We live in a world clouded by hysteria and hypocrisy, in which child abuse and poverty are rampant. We are living in a world torn apart by political and religious forces that shred us and make us feel so threatened and desperate that we seek an overall arching narrative to provide us with security. But as we pursue this narrative, or rather narratives, I believe we must first recognize that there is one common denominator running from ancient times to the very present that underlines many of our tales. We eat our young, and if we don't succeed, we confront them with a question to be or not to be eaten. We also nurture our young, but our nurturing is somewhat like the witch, what the witch offers in Hansel and Gretel, who wants to fatten Hansel and Gretel before she eats Hansel. Do we nurture our young so we can eat them? Is this what we call tradition? The major question in my talk is, do we nurture our young so we can eat them? Is this tradition? Do we nurture and cultivate them to transform them into cannibals and cutthroat barbarians who will eat their young? Do we tell fictional stories and maintain illusory traditions that foster intolerance, ignorance, racism, sexism, and wars? Why should we respect and maintain traditional storytelling if traditions are responsible for much of the misunderstandings and conflicts in the world today? And I want to add, we can see this in what's going on in Israel and with the Hamas, and we can see it also in Europe with regard to what is going on with the Russians and their aggressive ways. Do we tell fictional stories and maintain illusory traditions that foster intolerance, ignorance, racism, sexism, and wars? Why should we respect and maintain traditional storytelling if traditions are responsible for much of the misunderstandings and conflicts in our world today? Why should we be concerned whether traditional storytelling can survive or whether we are using the appropriate means to transmit customs, mores, and language when they may be anachronistic and deadly for our children and ourselves? Aren't the religious narratives of every living religion today intended to be taken as the gospel truth, somewhat responsible for crimes against children and humanity? How do we find truth in untruthful tales and believe traditional storytellers, priests, ministers, rabbis, tribal leaders, shaman, imam, gurus, and so on, who often blur our view of the world? They don't open it up. They often blur our view of the world to rationalize their own power. The only way we can do justice, in my opinion, is to the traditional tales and storytelling, is to problematize the value of these tales and to question the purpose of tradition and the role of the storyteller. Not all traditional tales are religious and demand belief in and obedience to the strictures of the tale. Not all traditional storytellers are holy people who call for blind faith in the putative truths of their tales. There are hundreds of types of traditional tales and many diverse traditional ways of telling tales. They will continue to exist and to be transmitted. So the questions we must ask about traditional tales and their survival concern: which traditional tales dominate in traditional storytelling and why? Is it realistically possible to convey a sense of the past about one's culture to people in the present through traditional storytelling? How is it possible to tell a tale from another culture through traditional storytelling? Is it worth the effort to use storytelling to bring about greater international understanding? If a great deal of traditional storytelling pertains to the question to be or not to be eaten, how can we use the same storytelling to feed listeners and tellers alike so that they will not have to fear abuse, abandonment, and betrayal? Clearly, the tales that become canonical in a society are those generally fostered by the church, state, and educational systems. The Christian, Jewish, Islamic, Buddhist religions, and others have made their mark in the world and organized storytelling so that their belief systems are spread not only from the political leaders and states have fostered stories about their histories, heroes, events, and incidents that have helped to construct a sense of community or nation. Schools and universities are sites where canonical tales and traditions are evaluated and debated. History, as we know, is not only written by the victors, but told by them and spread by victorious peoples from all walks of life. What becomes traditional and canonical is also relevant for survival and the maintenance of identity and community. Thus, not all the tales that have become canonical reinforce the dominant groups, of a particular society. Indeed, there are thousands, if not millions, of tales that people tell time and again, such as many of Aesop's fables, or fables similar to those he allegedly told, that bring people together and expose the contradictions of the powerful and suggest ways in which the oppressed can survive. One can perhaps talk about a canonical tradition of storytelling. For instance, there are many legends that question the authoritarianism of authority figures. Canonical tales are not stale, they're not static, and they foster many different versions that are worth studying because they reflect changing values, morals, and politics in a given society. Nevertheless, we must bear in mind that to become literate today, to function as a world citizen and attain power, an individual must know how to read and write, and to be able to reference standard traditional stories to prove his or her membership in a particular community. Whether an individual actually believes the appropriate story is not significant, just as long as the canonical tale has been registered and is registered in his brain. Once registered by the brain, tales have a mimetic, what I call a mimetic function. That is, they are like parasites and will feed off the brain and can be spread as memes to other brains through the spoken word. A culture of a particular group is established linguistically through narrative exchange that determines the relevance of belief systems which hold people together. As a group of people survive in a particular region, they continually cultivate their own relevant customs through different modes of storytelling to stabilize their lives and to transmit to their young their values, so the belief system will continue. Whoever controls the transmission, that is, the mediations of established values, mores, and customs, will have a powerful influence on the substance of thought and the manner in which people think and view their lives. Traditional storytelling is thus essentially conservative, tends to conserve the interest of the status quo, but it cannot exclude counter-traditional tales, for it cannot totally govern word of mouth. Nevertheless, the dominant tendency in Western societies by the state, German, church, governments, schools, and corporations is to place words in our mouths through all sorts of technological means so that we will repeat, memorize, and through conditioning, ape and initiate instead of gaining a sense of tradition through personal experience and experimentation. We are to learn often by rote what our tradition is and how we can come to know ourselves through mass mediated and censored stories. We are also, at least in America, expected to uproot ourselves, become mobile, adaptable, and replaceable, like the spare parts of a machine set up to operate automatically. If we accept the premise that tradition feeds off the young to maintain itself and will do anything to preserve itself, including the sacrifice of the young, storytellers who have a deep concern in preserving their different traditions are in a quandary, especially since there are currents and countercurrents of tradition that foster the autonomy of young and old alike, as well as tolerance and respect for difference. Perhaps quandary is the wrong word. Perhaps we must discuss the choices and responsibilities of storytellers and how traditions can be reutilized to reconstitute a deeper awareness of their meanings and their impact on our lives. In his thought-provoking book, The Past in Runes, David Gross argues that the otherness of tradition could be used more effectively for a radical critique of present-day capitalism in all its postmodern and post-industrialist forms. What is necessary is a critical appropriation of tradition, and here he relies on a key idea of Umfunktionierung. That's a German word, Umfunktionierung, which is translated into English, reutilization or refunctioning, developed by the German writers and intellectuals Ernst Bloch, Bertolt Brecht, and Walter Benjamin during the 1920s in their critique of fascism. Gross defines reutilization as extracting and rearranging elements from within the capitalist system in order to set them against capitalism itself, a process Bloch referred to as salvaging that which is true in false consciousness. Then he adds, I quote, as it turned out, however, the real masters of the art of refunctioning were not the German left-wing intellectuals, but the modern state and the modern economy. And the greatest successes of refunctioning have not been those that subverted bourgeois values, but those that transformed many of the old traditions, forcing them to serve ends for which they were not initially intended. End of quote. According to Gross, there were at least two types of refunctioning or reutilizing. The first kind takes charge of a certain current of tradition and maintains it by appending new meanings. The second kind takes possession of an entire tradition and imbues it with new layers of signification. A critique of tradition is therefore valuable only if it creates a new sense of tradition by revealing how fruitless it is to reclaim or recuperate tradition. By seeing tradition as the other, we gain a sense of what was unfulfilled and still needs to be fulfilled. Certainly, Gross's critique of how the authenticity of tradition is maintained is valid, but he tends to view the problems of the transmission of tradition too much from the viewpoint of the manipulators and is concerned with developing a theoretical critique. Instead, we must ask what the role did and do the majority of people or the folk play. And I do not mean folk in the romantic and nostalgic sense of the word, as those rural people close to nature, and living in a non-commodified community. I mean the majority of people in different societies who define themselves through communal associations where they interact with groups of long or short duration. Gross is apparently so concerned about how traditions are viewed and manipulated from above that his major concern is with the exposure of such manipulation and theoretical analysis. Unfortunately, he does not seek to understand how people of different classes and creeds come together to create customs, art forms, and social codes to give themselves a sense of identity and cohesion. What good is critical appropriation if it does not enable people to sustain their life worlds and give their endeavors some sense of meaning through story or history. Or put another way, how have people from different classes and creeds been using their traditions, and in light of the instrumentalization of their traditions by religions, schools, and market forces, how have they told all kinds of traditional tales to endow their existence on this planet with meaning? To begin to answer these questions even partially, we must return to Bloch, Brecht, and Benjamin, because they raise the question of, as I pointed out before, Umfunktionierung, not as an intellectual one, but to address political and cultural practice during the 1920s and 1930s. That is, each one of these writers and philosophers were concerned that the people, the folk, might become folkish, and the people might become popularist in a reactionary cause. Indeed, their traditions were being filled by Nazi reutilized myths that corresponded to an aestheticization of politics and culture that concealed manipulation. Bloch, Brecht, and Benjamin were concerned with developing strategies that the people could use to maintain their autonomy, and they tried to show how the Nazis were appropriating terms of folk traditions and creating their own false traditional symbols and narratives. To tell tales was to govern and navigate tradition, and Bloch, Brecht, and Benjamin were determined in the 1930s to underscore the cultural necessity of telling tales to deflate the myths of Nazism and to reutilize tradition to grasp historical manipulation. Of course, there was no free storytelling under the Nazis, but the clandestine, secret telling of tales was a way in which resistance was formed by different groups of people, and traditions were thus maintained in Germany and throughout Europe during fascism. Although some people would maintain that fascism has resurfaced in different forms in America and other parts of the world, we are not living in a totalitarian society. As long as we have freedom of speech, as long as we have freedom of speech in the public sphere, storytelling can play a vital role to enable us to grasp the value or non-value of traditions. Processes such as customization and the construction of the pastiche make this self-evident. Whereas many folklorists and storytellers have tended to glorify the past in ruins of their work until the 1970s, there's also been a more recent and also strong tendency to reflect critically upon the past as lore, folklore. They recover it's being used to mark out a future that can lead to a new sense of community. No matter what position we take with regard to tradition, it is clear that the past can devour us as we devour our children if our position is not critical and transformative. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for this wonderful speech. We asked the students to ask you questions, so we will be hearing some of those questions shortly.
Ô, Bruna, acho que eu vou aproveitar esse vácuo e vou fazer a primeira pergunta aqui, ó, enquanto o pessoal pensa. Você traduz para ele, por gentileza?
I'll do my best. Yeah, so Julio will ask you a question. I'll try to translate. I'll do my best.
É. I will try to ask in Portuguese because our students don't speak English, so I'll ask in Portuguese and then you can answer in English and Moody will translate for us.
Okay.
Então tá. Ô, Bruno, pergunte por gentileza se ele acha que é possível a gente fazer um estudo de contos de fadas por uma vertente mais social, mais política, mais, como eu diria assim, se os contos de fadas podem refletir as políticas das sociedades, guerras, corrupção, pessoas que buscam a justiça, e etc. Ok?
Okay. Did you hear Maud's translation?
No, no,
Okay,
I
because
heard it in Portuguese.
okay, because I when Julio started to speak, Julio, can you say it again? Because when you started speaking in Portuguese, I started listening to her and it was like a mess. Tem que pedir para ele, né? Porque eu também, a hora que muda aí, o meu não muda, aí vira uma bagunça. So, they're asking you to change the audio so that you can hear her translation or mine.
Should I go to the
There's a globe
yes,
next
yes,
to
I
the
went to
reactions.
yes. And should I press Portuguese or English? English.
Yes, English. I would
Okay.
advise English.
Okay, I pressed English. Yes. Yes, I can. Yeah. Yes. Yes. There's there are many tales, not only in the Brothers Grimm, but Anderson in the 19th century. A lot of the writers and tellers of tales would try to, because they might be imprisoned or killed, they always metaphorically told tales that seemed harmless, but were actually a big critique of the people who had power and were abusing people and children. Let me give you an example. One of the tales, my favorite tales, is how six made their way through the world. And it's a tale about a soldier who has served about 30 years for, and don't forget the Grimm's tales were written and collected during during wartime in Central Europe, okay, in Germany and France, Napoleon, and so on and so forth. And so most of the peasants were drafted to serve a king whom they hated and disliked. And so this particular tale reflects, or that I'm just going to summarize the plot of the tale. It's about this soldier who, at the end of the serving for 20 years a king, he goes and asks for his pay after so many years. And the king says, "Get out of here, I'm not giving you any money." And so the soldier leaves and he says, "I'm going to get even with you." And as he goes into the forest, he meets this strong, great, big, huge guy carrying 5 trees on his back. And he says to this man, who is also an ex-soldier, "I could use somebody like you. Come with me." And then they march, they go a little further, and there's a man shooting at a butterfly 5 miles away. The butterfly is just sort of camping out in a house or on a house. And he takes aim and shoots the butterfly. The butterfly, he misses, but he almost hits it. And so the major figure says, I can use somebody like you. And then they come across another guy who runs faster than anybody in the world. He can go around the globe, the entire globe, in 5 minutes. And so they also get him. Then there's another man who can drink and swallow an entire lake or ocean. And so they get him too. So all of these 6 sort of ex-soldiers marched back toward the king who had fired them. And the king is saying, anybody who can beat my daughter in a race can marry her. And the leader of the group says to the king, can my men help me if I need help? And he says, of course, my wife will easily beat you. So they begin the race, and the man is winning the race, and he's so far ahead of her that he sits down and takes a nap. In the meantime, the woman, who the daughter of the king, gets to him and turns around and is going back to in the race, going back to the castle. And so then the leader asks the man who can shoot anything to shoot a rock, shoot out the rock so that it falls and he'll wake up. And so he does. He wakes up and he realizes he's got to continue to run and defeat the girl, which he does, the princess. And then the king says, no, I don't want to give you anything after what's happened. And the 6 men get very angry, and they because they're so strong and so amazing, they take everything from the castle and leave and then depart and go away and share everything together. So this is a tale about war. It's a tale about how people were being treated during this time at the beginning of the 19th century, but it's not recognizable as a realistic tale. It's a tale that metaphorically deals with an issue that was rampant in the entire 19th century. Even today, in the 21st or whatever century we are, there are tyrants who force people, young men, to serve them and to die for nothing. And so it's really important for us to know, to select what tales we can use effectively to criticize tyrants or Nazis and so on. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, I have three questions here. People sending by chat, private chat, and I think it's one question in the chat, public chat. Is that right? É isso, né?
There are 2 questions on the chat,
Okay.
the public one.
So you can read, Bruna, please, the questions, the public questions, and that after I can read the private questions that I received.
Do you want me to read in Portuguese or in English? I think he will be hearing the translation by bot, right? So I can hear it. I can read it in.
Yes, yes, I can.
Então, pessoal, ele vai responder a primeira pergunta da Érica.
I wish I could. I wish I could become a child again. Yes, but I take. Let me put it this way. I've always felt somewhat like a child because I enjoy the type of work I do. I've never worked because somebody ordered me to work or to do something or to write something or to tell something. I've worked with children quite a bit in my life, and I've worked with colleagues developing theories and things like that. And all of these things have brought great joy to my life. I mean, at times I've not always been successful, but for the most part, I've felt that what I've tried to contribute to a decent society which doesn't kill children, which doesn't order them like they were prisoners in a camp. It's this reason why I continue to talk and to write.
Thank you.
You're
There's another question by Anderson. Now I'm going to read in Portuguese and you're going to hear her translation. Professor, qual o seu conto de fadas preferido? Aquele que mais te tocou na alma e por quê? Outra pergunta, há autores atuais de contos de fadas?
Could you repeat the question? I didn't hear it. Yes. But yes, yeah. Yeah. Let me begin with the last question first. I was Angela Carter, who's a feminist writer of fairy tales. She unfortunately died about 10 or 15 years ago. We were good friends, and I really admire her. And she was very important because she was one of the writers, a feminist writer, who showed younger women that they can change the tales, and so that they're not so, let us say, authoritarian. So that's an answer to your last question. And what was the first question again? Oh, my favorite tale. My favorite tale is actually how 6 made their way through the world. So it's a tale I love to tell time and again.
Thank you. Now we have a question by Lorena. Professor, o que despertou interesse para escrever os contos de fadas e o que te motivou para continuar escrevendo?
Well, until I began writing as a young professor, many years ago. I'm 86 years old, and so I have a long history. And what sort of made me, or compelled me, that's a better word, compelled me to start writing about fairy tales and to work with children with fairy tales is because a lot of fairy tales are very sexist, are very cruel, and really, as I've said, children are eaten up or used, or it doesn't matter what writer you read, and whoever writes fairy tales tends to ignore the fact that children are quite often harmed by them. So what I began to go to early public schools of very young children to learn from them what they liked, what they didn't like, what they were scared about, and so on and so forth. And that's when I began writing a lot of books about different fairy tales and how they can be exploited to help children to think about things, to become critical, and not to just simply accept them as they are. So that is the reason I'm a very political person. And so one of the reasons I began writing many, many books is because I wanted to try to use tales to change things, to create real democracies. And that's what I've been doing up to now, even during my retirement.
Thank you. There's another question by João Paulo. Professor, você acha que as adaptações de cinema mais fiéis, como Pinóquio de Guilherme Del Toro, têm o mesmo efeito que os contos originais?
Could you repeat the question again? It's a difficult question to answer because of the fact that there are so many filmmakers who have taken fairy tales and changed them around in a very progressive way. And so there's a recent Pinocchio film that is very progressive, and it shows that Pinocchio is exposed to the Nazis in Italy. And so there are different, like Walt Disney's adaptation of fairy tales tend to be very conservative because he was very conservative. So we have to know the ideological views of writers and filmmakers in order to question or understand the meaning of the works that they produce. And today, fortunately, it used to be that Walt Disney sort of dictated everything that went on in animated films. And that, fortunately, that's no longer the case. There are many, like Miyazaki, the Japanese filmmaker, is brilliant, much more brilliant than any of the films that Walt Disney ever made. So I think the answer to the question is that we have to look at the experimental animated films, or maybe they're not animated, sometimes they're realistic films, and to try to understand the ideology behind the tales.
Thank you. And we have a question by Cleide. Professor, contos de fadas, em quais contos de fadas podemos dizer que são as narrativas dos problemas e desafios que todos nós enfrentamos no cotidiano?
Yes, I agree. I think that not all the fairy tales reflect upon the situations or conditions in our daily lives, but a good many of them do. And that's one of the reasons why we want to pay attention to them, particularly since children learn these tales very early in their lives, and they can either enable them to become storytellers of their own lives, or they can have they can be sort of commanded by other people because they don't know how to think critically. So I think that what is really most important is that we continue to enjoy the fairy tales, but also to look upon them as possible influences on young people who tales that might help them and also tales that might hurt them.
Thank you. We have one last question by Efraim. Professor, você acredita que seu contato com os contos de fadas lhe fez ser um sujeito mais sensível para interpretar o mundo real?
Definitely. I think that I never thought that I would be writing and speaking and working with fairy tales for most of my life. When I went to college, my early years, when I was a teenager and in my early 20s, I really did not plan to write about fairy tales. I discovered when I began understanding how profound, how deep they actually are, even though they seem to be very simple, they're amazingly effective and profound and deal with every problem that we have not resolved. And to give you, to sort of end on another example, when I looked at Little Red Riding Hood, I realized that everybody generally accepts it as a simple tale of a little girl who was foolish and told the wolf where to go, and the wolf eats the grandmother and then later on eats her. Now, basically, though, when you look at it historically and trace it all the way back to the medieval period, it's a story about rape. It's a story about how girls are raped by the wolf man. And so it's very important to take this tale and to change it around and to work with it with children and to talk, not to sort of dictate to the children how they should read it, but to try to explore how they accept it and why, and whether they would enjoy many. There are about 1,000 different Red Riding Hoods nowadays, where the wolf always gets beaten by the girl. And so, in other words, there's been a big change because of the women's movement in the world. And it's not all throughout the entire world, but through a good part of the world. Women are much stronger and will not put up with a wolf. And so this is one of the reasons we have to turn to these tales and to try to take from these tales the wisdom that they have.
Thank you so much. I just have a personal question. Before we begin, you told me that you went to Germany to study. How do you think that your experience there helped to shape your fairy tale view about the Grimm's tale and your work?
Oh, a great deal. I went to Germany in the 1950s, and I learned a great deal at the university and with friends, plays and things like that. And I listened to their interpretations, which were different from mine. And so I learned a lot from my experiences in Germany. And I don't regret. I come from a Jewish family. And so when I wanted to go there, my parents and my friends didn't want me to go to Germany. And I said, no, I want to experience, I want to learn about the world and why certain things happened. And I made the right choice. I've spent something like 10 altogether, about 10 or 15 years in Germany, France, Italy, England. I'm a Europhile. I love to go to Europe all the time.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think Julio has some questions.
Eu? Ah, é que eu não escutei vocês dois. Eu pergunto em inglês ou em português? Ele me escuta? Eu pergunto em inglês. Tá, ok. É para as pessoas da sala, né? Acho que eles pegam de alguma forma, né? Eu vou perguntar em português, então. Professor, I received some questions in the private chat. I will pass them on to you. Uh, the first one, a primeira é um pouco teórica. Acredito que alguém que está fazendo uma dissertação ou um TCC. Você concorda que os contos de fadas têm etapas, como alguns teóricos dizem? A travessia,
Save me.
depois o encontro, depois a dificuldade a ser superada e finalmente a conquista? Me parece, a mim, Júlio, uma visão muito matemática dos contos de fadas, da qual eu particularmente discordo um pouco. Gostaríamos de ouvir a sua opinião.
Uh, mm. Yeah, yeah, I agree with him. I don't think fairy tales are very different depending on the country and the belief systems in a country. They we have to be careful not to generalize about fairy tales. I mean, in most fairy tales, there are no fairies. Why why aren't there enough fairies to be in all the fairy tales? And so we have to be careful about generalizing, and we have to try to understand each tale depending on how much research you want to do. You can work like on Little Red Riding Hood. I wrote a whole book about Little Red Riding Hood, and so on. So in other words, it's very, very important to be aware of all the influences on a particular tale and how a particular tale has been treated in various countries and among different age groups and things like that.
Ok. Posso perguntar a segunda? Ok, the second one. Alguém quer saber what's the relationship, qual a relação entre contos de fadas e Harry Potter, o fenômeno que se tornou Harry Potter?
Yeah, I've written about Harry Potter critically, and I've pointed out that that it's not, despite the fact that everybody loves it and thinks it's a great work, it really is stale and is not very deep uh, uh, when you compare it to the tales that are from the 18th and 19th centuries. So I have written about this already.
Okay, what's the name of your book of Harry Potter, Professor? I really would like to read it.
I have to send that to you because I've forgotten the title of the book, and I don't have my library is downstairs. So, but I will. I can send that to you.
Thank you. Ok, thank you. Ok, a terceira pergunta. What do you think of Disney's misinterpretations of the originals? O que você acha das deturpações dos originais praticados pela Disney?
The Disney films? I have a very low opinion of all the Disney films. Very low.
Ok, me too, professor. The final question.
Yes.
Are fairy tales a market strategy today? Os contos de fadas são uma estratégia de mercado hoje?
Are they a marketing strategy? I'm not too sure.
Sim, sim, eu acredito que sim. A pergunta veio curta. Eu acho que a pessoa quer saber se os contos de fadas hoje são usados enquanto estratégia para vender produtos, cadernos, bonecas. Eu acho que é essa a questão.
Yes, 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 of course. Yeah, there are like Disney markets all the fairy tales in clothes and shoes and shirts and you name it. But it's not the only corporation in America that uses fairy tales for publicity. But because the fairy tales are so loved by children and adults, they're very and they're recognizable. Almost everybody, maybe in the world, I don't know, maybe that's an exaggeration, but in most countries in the world, Disney has managed to use publicity through the fairy tales with sort of a great, let us say, excuse me, after talking too much. Now, Disney has profited from using the fairy tales in all sorts of ways, including the big parks, the Disney parks throughout the world, and in all the types of clothes and sporting goods that they produce. So yes, unfortunately, one could say that fairy tales have been tarnished by the Disney Corporation and other corporations. I think I have to go now. I'm sort of getting a little dry here, and also my wife will kill me if I don't come to dinner soon.
Okay, Professor, thank you so much for your speech. It was such an honor for us on
Ok,
behalf of
acho
the
que já
children.
podemos ir terminando. Eu vou falando, você traduz a ele, Modeste, por favor. Professor, nós queremos te agradecer imensamente, o senhor, uma sumidade na área, com 100 livros escritos, nos seus 86 anos de idade, O senhor é uma lenda para nós, e nós aqui, humilde pesquisadores brasileiros, a gente só quer agradecer a sua oportunidade de nos falar hoje. Esse evento vai ficar gravado e nossos estudantes
Yes.
vão ter a oportunidade de ver. Só queria que o senhor dissesse, para terminar mesmo, qual conselho você nos daria para pesquisar, para quem quer começar a pesquisar contos de fadas hoje? Começar como? Por onde? Para ver o quê? Ler o quê? Muito obrigado.
Yes. That's a difficult question because the first thing that I would recommend is that you look into the folk tales, the oral traditions in your country. Go and maybe go into the forests or where the people live. Not people like myself, where people actually live and work and so on. They tell tales. And I think if you begin that way and begin to hear the tales, analyze the tales, tape the tales, talk to the people who tell the tales, I think that'd be a wonderful, wonderful way to begin.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Have a nice dinner.
Thank you very much. Nice meeting you all. Bye-bye.
Bruna, você quer... ok, estamos terminando, né? Thank you, professor.
Então, pessoal, a gente vai encerrar o segundo dia do encontro e amanhã a gente se vê por aqui, que vai ter mais um especialista para falar com a gente aqui.
Obrigado, pessoal. Obrigado, Mudo. Valeu, viu? Obrigadão, gente. Até amanhã.